Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The shifting sands of geopolitics have turned into a tsunami. With Saudi Arabia upping the ante with greater sectarian escalation, where does the Syrian conflict stand? Washington's neocons and Riyadh's Wahhabi royals again share common cause. And where does Russia's strategy fit in? To CrossTalk Russia in the Middle East, I'm joined by my guest, Mark Sloboda, here in Moscow. He's an international affairs and security analyst. Also in the studio with me is Dmitry Babich. He is a political analyst with Sputnik International. And in London, we cross to Alexander Mercouris. He's a writer on legal affairs and an analyst. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Dima Babich, let's talk first with broad strokes here. What's your take on Saudi Arabia's escalation of sectarianism here? It's not only Saudi Arabia has broken relations with Tehran, but it has gotten a lot of the other regional players to do the same here. Is this a risky gambit?
Well, I mean, morally, it is simply indefensible because, okay, 47 people were executed. Iran was enraged by this. There's nothing immoral about being enraged by an execution. And here we have
particularly this one cleric that was
Nimr al-Nimr. And the Western community of nations also could not stay silent because,
with the exception of the United States, I'm afraid.
Yes, okay? Right. But just recently, the Sakharov Prize was given in Europe in absentia to Mr. Raif Badawi, a Saudi dissident who was basically sentenced to 1,000 whips and 10 years in jail. So the West, in this situation, also could not accept it. But the West is somehow silent about this anti-Iranian coalition, which reminds me of a kind of a Sunni NATO created obviously by neoconservatives from Washington, or with their tacit support. And I'm afraid this NATO is going to behave very much like NATO 1 in Europe. Continuous pressure on the countries such as Iran, such as Iraq, the Shia-dominated minorities.
Not to speak of the Syrian conflict here. If I can go to Mark here also in the studio with me. This is very important here, because Saudi Arabia, it appears to me, is pursuing a gambit in which there's a lot of things that will happen. Is that, first of all, it keeps Western eyes off of, or Western media eyes off of what's going on in Yemen. Again, refocusing everything that the Americans have hated about the Middle East for 40 years, Iran. And it also puts a stop to anything that could happen with the Syrian peace process, as problematic as it is. Do you agree?
Oh, yeah. We're Saudi with the new Saudi regime, which has continued and then exacerbated on the foreign policy risky adventures of the previous king, the new king and his young defense minister. They have become a rogue state. I mean, we could easily speak of the United States as a rogue state on the world stage, its ally Israel, and then the other tripod of hegemony in the Middle East is Saudi Arabia, and perhaps they are the greatest loose cannon at this part. We have to remember that Saudi Arabia is now, depending on the assessment, either the 4th or 5th largest procurer of arms in the world after the United States, China, and Russia. Obama, Cameron, Canada, Germany, France, they are all selling tens of billions of dollars of arms to this bloody Saudi regime every year. Obama, in 1 year alone, sold them $84 billion worth of fighter jets, which they are now using to bomb and invade the poorest country in the Middle East.
Is Yemen.
Alexander,
if I go to you in London here, Dmitry Babich was absolutely correct that there was a lot of moral outrage with the executions. It was a week ago. Throughout most of the world, part of the West, but not in the United States, inside the Beltway, the neocons were rejoicing. Finally, again, they were showing Saudi Arabia and the Wahhabis in Riyadh that the United States and Saudi Arabia see eye to eye. They blamed everything remarkably on Iran for the executions in Riyadh. Go ahead.
Yes, because the point is that we have two parallel processes going on in the Middle East. One is a process of regime change across the Middle East that has been underway now for over 15, 20 years, which is driven by the United States and by the neocons within the United States. We've seen strikes on Iraq, on Libya, on Syria. on all sorts of other places. And at the same time, against that, we also have Saudi Arabia's own policy, its great duel with Iran for regional hegemony, its attempt to control or to stop various changes that are happening within the Middle East, which it sees as threatening to itself. Those two forces move in parallel, and they've come together, and we now see an alliance, in effect, between the neocon foreign policy establishment in the United States and the Saudi monarchy.
Okay, Dima Babic, it appeared to me that Saudi Arabia, through its actions, through its spoiler effect in Syria, its attack on one of the poorest countries in the world, Yemen, because of Iranian influence, well, that may be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Iran may end up being more active in Yemen, though there's no evidence they were before here. Saudi Arabia wants everyone in the region to choose sides. And the United States, with its, and I would give credit to Barack Obama for the nuclear deal that it made with Tehran. Maybe they have buyer's remorse now, but they did make that agreement. Saudi Arabia wants to reverse that.
Well, that's true, and the United States is remarkably patient with its ally. You know,
That's a very nice word to put.
Yeah, let's remember that in the first place, 15 out of 19 terrorists who, basically attacked the United States in 2001, they were from Saudi Arabia. Not a single one from Iraq, not a single one from Afghanistan.
Not one from Syria, not one from Syria.
Later. Yeah, and the problem is that it seems to me that the United States decided to sort of outsource to Saudi Arabia the work of destroying the sovereign regimes in the Middle East. And Saudi Arabia is rallying behind itself the other Sunni regimes, primarily the monarchies, but not only, in doing that. And the problem is that they are creating dividing lines in the Middle East in the same way NATO 1 created dividing lines in Europe, even between such close nations as Russia and Ukraine. So basically, it's the same tragedy, the same methods are being used, these small differences between, Russians and Ukrainians, Shia and Sunni. Shias and Sunnis have been living in peace for centuries in these areas.
Exactly. Mark, it's really remarkable here. Is that, Dima Babic is the sort sovereign states here, but the U.S. is working with a royal family. And I always make sure we talk about the royal family of Saudi Arabia, because there are millions of people that live there. They're not represented there. There's a Shia minority that is discriminated against. But the United States has decided, and I guess we go all the way back to the Afghan war when the Soviet Union was in Afghanistan, is that it's chosen to use extremist Wahhabi ideology in these groups to pursue foreign policy ends in that region. And their hands are very, very bloody here. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just a monarchy. It is a bloody, theocratic regime which is actively spreading Salafism, the root ideology behind almost the entirety of what we consider Islamic terrorism around the world. It can all be sourced back ideologically to Saudi clerics and the Saudi regime. The German intelligence agency in the last few months just issued a report, as the German press has leaked, that this new Saudi king and defense minister present not only a serious security threat to the stability of the Middle East, but a security threat to Germany itself. And Angela Merkel tried to quiet this down. But I want to play a little thought experiment. Let's pretend the headlines didn't read that there was 47 people, including a Shia cleric, who criticized the Saudi regime who were executed. Let's pretend that this was a Catholic priest who criticized, or a feminist activist who was beheaded by this Saudi regime. And we see where our prejudices lie here. Let's not forget that this Saudi regime colluded with the United Kingdom to make Saudi the head of the UN Human Rights Council.
We could do it. We could do. Let me go to Alex real quick here because I think it's really.
Just all
right, Dima, go ahead, real quick.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Because I think it's important. The BND in its report. Let me just quote it: the far-sighted diplomatic strategy of the older leadership members has been replaced by the policy of impulsive interventionism since the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, actually became the main figure in the defense ministry and in the foreign ministry.
Okay,
but this is also dangerous for Russia because
I want to
Russia's
talk about
deals.
Russia in the second half of the program here.
Yes.
Alex, let me go back to you in London here. These are very dangerous allies to have, these Gulf countries, particularly Saudi Arabia. Very unpredictable, I would say, over the last year. It's very aggressive foreign policy that has gotten no gains whatsoever for Saudi security or anybody else in the region, I would say. The thing is, I want to stress here is that maybe Obama and some of the people around him, a minority, if people have been watching this program over the years, I mean, they want to undermine this nuclear deal they made with Iran because this is, the Saudis believe, the United States is trying to hedge its bets, which any rational foreign policy thinker would do that when it comes to the Middle East. But the people in Saudi Arabia and the neocons that are surrounding Obama primarily don't want that to happen. Go ahead.
That is exactly the problem, because Saudi Arabia is appalled by the nuclear deal with Iran, with which it was not consulted about, and of course it has identified Iran as its major enemy. So what it is doing is that it is pursuing its duel against Iran, seeking to undermine that agreement, and in the process is destabilizing the whole of the Middle East. And the United States has allied itself with a country that is now the major destabilizing factor in the Middle East, which is, of course, the exact opposite of what the United States ought to be doing. Given that the United States is the world's leading country and the country that needs to have oil and trade moving peacefully, it should be seeking stabilization, not destabilization.
Never look for rationality out of Washington these days. Gentlemen, we have to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Saudi Arabia and Russia's strategy. Stay with RT. Okay, Alex, I'd like to go back to you in London here and shifting gears a bit. How do you assess Russia's foreign policy prospects in light of what we just talked about in the first half of the program? Go ahead.
Well, the Russians are now the major force for stabilization in the Middle East, in contrast to the United States, which has been trying to destabilize the Middle East. It has opposed all the attempted regime change processes that have been happening there. It has attempted to stabilize the situation in Syria by supporting the political government there and pursuing a political solution to the Syrian conflict. And it is even trying to mediate, not very successfully it must be said, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The Russians are trying to keep communications open to everybody, to get everybody talking to each other in order to try and find a peaceful solution to all of these problems. And I think that the only reason the Russians are doing this is because they realize better than almost any other government that destabilization and violent sectarianism and chaos in the Middle East are a threat to everybody.
Okay, Dima, common sense we just heard there, but we don't see it in policy coming from the West. Go ahead.
I remember I once interviewed our former ambassador in Kabul, and he said Russia has no choice but to talk to everyone, because we are weaker than the United States, so we have to be smarter. Russia was one of the probably the only country in the world where we could have Ismail Haniyeh from Hamas, from Gaza, coming to Moscow. And then in a few days, Avigdor Lieberman, the hawkish foreign minister of Israel, also came here. In the same way, just recently, Lavrov visited all the countries of the Middle East, all the Sunni monarchies, some of them very opposed to Russia. But still, he talked to all of them. And little by little, I hope this policy will pay off, because there are changes even in the policies of of European countries. Let me quote what the number 2 person in Germany, Sigmar Gabriel, said recently, warning Saudi Arabia against financing terrorism. He said, "It is from Saudi Arabia that Wahhabi mosques are financed all over the world.
Yeah.
The time when Germany looked the other way is over." End of quote.
Well, I don't know. That's optimism.
I'm
here.
skeptical.
I don't
I'm
see
skeptical,
that.
but there is a chance.
I
There is
see
a chance for dialogue.
these countries always following America's lead for a wide variety of reasons here. Mark, let me go to you. At the very end of last year, we heard some good noises about a process that could end or get a ceasefire in Syria and start some kind of political process. Now, in the matter of not even short number of weeks, short number of days, all of that seems to have come. Let me go to Mark here first in Moscow, because this is throwing one stone and hitting a lot of birds, a lot of crows, I would say, ugly ones here. And this is what Saudi Arabia is doing.
Yeah, the same people who were making nice noises were also making nice noises a few years ago about the Geneva process and then the Vienna process. And I'm afraid we're at the same logger books that we were before. It all comes down to Assad, the opposition between Iran and Saudi Arabia, between the U.S. and Russia, between a secular republic and Salafist jihadism. We're not getting anywhere. The conference of rebels, there were actually 3 conferences of rebels, one of rebels who hadn't picked up arms in Damascus, which would actually be the moderates in Syria. There was another one held by the Kurds, which are supported by both Russia and the U.S., but bombed by Turkey. And then there was this jihadist conference in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia.
Which we need to point out that not everybody on the list even knew that they were invited.
Yeah, not everyone knew they were invited, but the principal actor in this conference, Ahrar al-Sham, which is an offshoot of al-Qaeda, that is the second biggest holder of territory in Syria after ISIS. They basically walked out of the conference because they refused to accept words in the resolution such as democracy, Assad, and other things. Right? So this just blew up the whole entire Western and Saudi position entirely. This really destroys their strategy, because I believe their strategy was to try to legitimize Ahrar al-Sham in the political process of transition, and then move all the forces of al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, and just change their name to Ahrar al-Sham.
See, this is what again, if I go back to Alex in London, this is why I think most of the players in the region don't trust the United States anymore as a fair broker, because they break their word all of the time. Every time John Kerry leaves Russia, if it's Moscow or Sochi, he says one thing, but by the time his plane is landed in Washington, he says something else here. Alex, I want to go back to something you said earlier, because I think it's very interesting here. Because of what Mark just said, is that I do believe, and I'm going to go against the conventional wisdom here, is that because of everything that Mark said, and you and Dima Babic on this program, is that there is a military solution to Syria. And this is what Russia to some extent, foresaw months ago. That's one of the reasons why they decided to accept the invitation from Damascus, because right now, that is the only realistic way to end the civil war, is to win it militarily, because there are no other people to talk to. Okay, these people are not willing to sit down and put their arms down, and this regime is going to survive in Damascus. It's going to be through military force. I'm sorry to break the conventionalism. Go ahead.
I'm afraid I actually agree with that, and I've been saying it for some time. I think that people who think that this is going to go on forever are overestimating the attraction to people in Syria of these various jihadist groups that exist there. I think given the choice between stable, orderly government, such as only the Syrian government can provide, and these jihadi groups, most people in Syria will choose the government in Damascus. And especially if steps are taken to expand and reform that government. I think the Russians understand that. And I think that is what we're going to slowly see. It's not going to happen very quickly, at least not for a couple of months. But I personally think that if this process continues for very much longer, we will start to see in about a couple of months' time a significant military advance. Now, the problem with that is that in every situation where it looks like the situation in Syria is stabilizing militarily, we start to see an escalation from the other side. And that's when I think the moment of greatest danger will come.
The introduction of TOW missiles being the
escalation of the military.
A year ago, yes.
Okay. Dima, go ahead.
Yes, but still,
Yes.
I think, let's return to Russia's strategy. I think Russia's strategy is to ally Russia with all the sensible forces on all the sensible issues.
Enumerate. Who are they? Who are they?
Well, I mentioned the German authorities, which accused Saudi Arabia of Salafism recently, and which made some very tough statements, because this is becoming dangerous for Germany also.
Dima, how many times do we have to place false hope in Europe? From Ukraine to Syria for years now. When are we going to give up on believing that the Europeans will see rationality?
It's hard to disagree with Mark.
It's hard to disagree, but I think we should keep trying, because this
Hope
is the
dies
only way.
last,
Hope
but it dies
last.
painfully.
The second important player here is Iran. Let me remind you that we're at a critical stage, because the so-called implementation day is nearing, and that will be the moment of truth. And the Iranian President Rouhani has just said a very important phrase now. Let me quote: "You can't at the same time weaken the Syrian authorities and claim to be fighting terrorism there." End of quote.
Exactly.
This is the point where Russia can be allied with Iran.
Alex, really to mix this up here, I mean, I tend to agree. You just heard me agree with Mark. However, one thing that can change policy is deep, deep fear. And this is something with this immigration problem hitting Europe, and it's not going to be over. This is beginning to hit the masses, if I can use that term, where people are beginning to realize that foreign policy can have an impact on everyday life. Now, this is what may be different, but I've been in business and I've been in media for a long time. Never say, this time it will be different. Don't say that. Go ahead. Go ahead, Alex.
Well, what I think, if we turn to Europe, the point about Europe is that there's a positive push and then there's a negative pull.
Yeah.
I don't think that anything is going to happen that is going to persuade European governments to turn round and say what we've been doing for the last couple of years is a mistake and we should now support President Assad.
Not these governments.
If we are looking, not these governments.
Good point.
However, if we are looking at an escalation of the situation, as we saw in 2013 when there was the attempt to use the Ghouta chemical attack to attack Syria, and as we could again see in a couple of months' time, if there is a military breakthrough, then I think there are political pressures in Europe that can act on it as a brake on that. And if there is a brake on that in Europe, then it might act as a certain kind of brake on the US. One shouldn't overestimate the importance of this. And certainly, I think Mark Sloboda is right. There will be no great conversion in Europe amongst the elites to a change of philosophy. But the elites are not the only players in Europe. I live in a European country. I can see that.
Okay, Mark, let's talk about Russia's strategy over the next few months here. Where do you think it's going to go?
Okay, so I want to touch on exactly that. Because while Russia is playing the diplomatic game and Dima's placing his hopes with European politicians, Russia is not. Okay? You are exactly right. Russia is making diplomatic overtures, but at the same time, I believe they are assuming that these will fail, that they will only further divide the allies between Turkey, the EU, the US,
NATO,
the Saudis, all of them on this, and they are pressing ahead with a military strategy that has forces and players on the ground in the region all together that can, to a large extent, maybe not take back all of Syria, but to take back a significant portion of it, relegating jihadist forces to the desert. This is the Syrian government and its army and its militia defense forces. This is Hezbollah. This is Iran. This is Iraq. This is the Kurds.
And the Russian Air Force.
And the Russian Air Force. And they are winning. They are winning strategic victories across all the fronts. And this has the neocons, the jihadi fanboys that inhabit the Western think tanks like Charles Lister running scared.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to have to revisit this maybe even as early as next week. We've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Moscow and London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules.
long scientists. I love your voice.